Guys, we have some great people here today. Joe had me like crawling up the walls. I was like, stop talking to me because I can't ask you about this a second time on stage. This is too cool. Meanwhile, Javier is like exploding my head as he goes all the way into various ways to manage load based on type of compute based. I shouldn't have asked that question, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I stopped as soon as I saw that you wrote a handbook.
Oh, God.
So that being said, what we're looking at right now is the future of
Right.
managed load. But before we get to the future of managed load, what's the present of managed load? And for that matter, what are we talking about when we're talking about managed load? I'll throw it out to any of you.
Currently, managed load, I think it's still under development. One of the key things that's been introduced in the market is flexibility, which is our Bitcoin mining over the past 10 plus years. It's been developing, it's been helping the grid, it's been helping it stabilize, capturing the excess energy during high renewables, and ability for it to curtail when the grid's under stress. It's what I
You're always in trouble when you ask like somebody PhD level to break something down.
Oh, I can go smooth brain if we
Because they're like, oh, you want to hand it to Joe?
sure. Yeah.
You need to turn it off. It's
That'd be
helpful. Other side. Okay. There.
Okay, sorry. This okay? Yeah. Okay, cool. I think that's right. I think what we're seeing is the kind of the first version of managed load was kind of like almost commercial programs with utilities, right? Where they were it was kind of like a efficiency effort. And then you've seen it move into higher levels of flexibility because Bitcoin's the first geographically agnostic large flexible load that we've had. It's like the first capacitor on an electric board. It adds a lot of optionality to how you put in response. About 3 years ago, it was right about when I came to, actually it's 2 years ago when I came here for the conference, we were running some models that we stripped out AI load and Bitcoin load and put in the current penetration of renewables in the market. And we said, if we just have 3% load growth, which is what's forecast for like EVs and new families, you will need between 300 and 600 gigawatts of either new generation or flexible load by 2030 to avoid brownouts. So the thesis on managed load is you're going to need a huge percentage of that to be delivered from the grid because we physically cannot build that much spinning mass with our current infrastructure base. So that's where I think we're at.
Javier, what's your take on this? Because
what's managed load?
Yeah.
I would say managed load is any load that can be turned on and off at will. And that allows grids to become much more flexible when it comes to introduction of renewable energies, which are not great if you ask any engineer. Like as Marsha said before, like your base load should be coal and nuclear, maybe hydro, but definitely not non-inertial energy sources like solar and wind. And I agree with Joe. I mean, if you remove, I wouldn't include AI because it's not flexible, not yet. Or it could be flexible, you would say, but it's not interesting from an economic standpoint. Like the guys were talking before, like they make so much money per megawatt hour that it's like...
I'm just saying, Javier, that model included zero AI load growth, not even flexibility. Just that assumed you had zero AI megawatt.
Just residential. And
that's Resi and EV. That's the flexibility capacity we need to add for Resi and EV. It does not include any Bitcoin load and doesn't include any AI load.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's really scary.
That's mind-blowing. But yeah, so that would be my summary of what managed load is. And I think, not because we're at the Bitcoin mining summit, I would say the best load is Bitcoin mining, definitely, for all the reasons that all the previous panelists have already mentioned.
So Nima, you're in an interesting position in that you've written a handbook on managing load, and you work for a company actually called Load. That's how you pronounce that. Can you introduce us to some of the concepts that you have to familiarize people with when you're talking about load and managing load? Because this is something that I'm sure you have to learn from, the tech side, how to deal with these machines. But then you have to introduce a whole bunch of other folks who are working on the generation, transmission, and delivery side and go in, thank God you're doing the work, convincing all the engineers that this is a good idea. Can you introduce us to some of the key players in this space as the man who wrote the handbook on it?
Yeah, it's actually interesting when I started working with Mehdi on writing that handbook. I'll be very brief about it. It's I was in the process of transition, and next thing you know, Mehdi, he dumps about 200 data sets over to me, and he's like, "Go make sense of this and figure this out." And this is someone, a few years ago, I didn't even know how energy was produced and how it was getting distributed across to data center or to residentials, to industrial loads, and so on. And so I just had to go back to the basics, understand how energy is produced, where some of the key generations are happening, and what is creating this fluctuation or what's adding this volatility to the day-to-day prices of energy, to the energy price.
What were in those data sets?
So what was in those data sets was the relationship between your energy price and your generation. So we're looking at solar generation, wind generation. We're looking at our net load, which is our base load, which is generally either gas or coal. To some extent, depending on the region that you're in, it's your hydropower and your nuclear power. And that's your fundamental of figuring out how energy is generated and how this is impacted. The next thing that you want to be looking at is your on your demand side. Who are your key users of power, essentially, right? So when we look at it, the first thing that comes to mind is residential. It's our homes and air conditioning that we use, right? Next thing we add in there another layer of this is our EV chargers, is our electric vehicles and the charging that happen. You start add another load, it's your industrial mills, your commercial and your industrial load that's consuming energy, your hospitals, our factories that are in the region. And then next thing you see is a sudden ramp up of massive consumption of energy, which was unreal prior to Bitcoin, actually. Prior to Bitcoin, when we were talking about 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt of power, this was a significant draw of power. And now, with introduction of Bitcoin, now we start talking about 5 meg, 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts, and we're throwing these numbers out as if they're nothing. These are, a community of residential that's consuming power. And now with the AI workload that's coming in, and we're seeing similar numbers now, instead of your 20, 30, 40, 50 megawatt, 100 megawatts, we're seeing gigawatts. We're seeing 1 gigawatt, 5 gigawatt, Sam Altman from OpenAI is talking about requiring, 10 gigawatts of data center just for OpenAI only. I question that, how realistic those numbers are, but maybe that's for a debate for another day. But that would be the fundamentals that I would start looking at. Next thing we can get into is how is the grid supported, right? There are all these massive users of energy, and how is these supported? Now we have grid services in place, things that you might have heard of, demand response programs, ancillary services, regulation, frequency regulations, and a lot more that come into play. Now these are services that are there to support the grid in order to keep it stabilized throughout the fluctuation of energy, both by demand and also by generation as well.
So as we think about this absolutely massive tranche of data and you digging through it and going and making sense and making a mechanism that allows you to really manage load in an effective way that keeps the grid safe. I'd love to actually get a sense of what the history is. Javier, I know that you've been in the game for a couple of minutes when it comes to mining and using electricity.
Yes, a few years.
A few years.
Yes.
How many is a few years?
So I started mining in 2013 at home. But that's, I think it's a complete different approach to
That's
when you're mining at home and when you're mining at scale.
That's what I want to know. I want to know, when you listen to Nima talking about the state of the art and you go, when I was plugging stuff into my house sockets just hoping to not pop a breaker, could you have even imagined that this is where it was coming?
Honestly not. Like, I remember I actually burned a plug in my rental house there in Berlin, in Germany, by plugging, I don't know, like maybe 4 kilowatts or something at home. So no, I could not have imagined that this would move to these scales at that time. I was just doing it because it was fun, because it was free money, because it was uncensorable. It was, it was a new thing. It was incredible. But yeah, when you look at the scales that are managed today, it's mind-blowing, and the numbers that Joe threw there for the need of flexible load. Actually, I mean, it's great that Bitcoin mining grew up this much, because I think, again, like the parallel growth of intermittent, non-inertial energy sources together with Bitcoin mining has led to this, well, if you look at ERCOT, for example, since the blackout of 2021, the introduction of Bitcoin mining and the participation of miners into these demand response programs that Nima mentioned has led to that never happening again.
That's right.
If you look, I mentioned this last time I was on a panel in Dallas, back at Mining Disrupt. I mentioned the Spanish example, where I'm from,
Sure.
where we had a blackout last year because there's no flexible load. Yep. There's a lack of batteries, of battery storage, of BSS, and the lack of a flexible, manageable load like Bitcoin mining, and the introduction of a huge amount of renewables, of non-inertial renewables, led to this blackout. And now the latest reports that I read was some in the south of Spain, some very big solar farm went offline, inverters failed, it disconnected immediately. That led to a drop in frequency that could not be corrected because there was not enough BSS and there was no Bitcoin mining to stop.
Can you tease out what you mean when you're talking about inertial versus non-inertial?
Oh, yeah,
because I don't want that to go over the heads of folks who don't necessarily work on the generation side. What's inertial? What's non-inertial? Why does it matter so much if I have a ton of non-inertial and all of a sudden it shuts off?
Yeah, so there are spinning generation sources like hydro, coal, all of those that use a turbine, they will be spinning, and they're normally coupled with big, very big flywheels that keep that momentum, that angular momentum, right? So, and all the generation in a grid is synchronized. Is synchronized at a frequency. Here in the US, 60 hertz. In Europe, is 50 hertz. When you have, for example, an increase, when you flip a switch and you turn on, let's say, a 10 megawatt Bitcoin mining farm, that introduces a lot of resistance in the flow of electrons that will, if you don't have inertia, if you don't have that flywheel to keep pushing those electrons until the generation ramps up and introduces enough energy to keep moving those electrons, you will have a problem. This is what happened in Spain, because solar is not inertial, wind is not inertial. They don't have these big flywheels. If you have a drop in frequency, that drop will be much more significant when you don't have enough inertial energy sources.
It's sort of like not having a crumple zone on your car almost.
A what?
A crumple zone in your car. Like they designed the front of your car to actually crunch if you hit something. Now we're not crunching these
it's a
spinning
damper
apparatuses, but it's a damper of a sort.
It's kind of like a buffer, yeah. So you have that first buffer, you have battery storage as the very fast acting buffer, and then you have the slower acting buffer in flexible mining. You have, I mean, there's a lot like cold storage or I don't know, even glass melters. Like there are different types of industries that will participate and that, can be curtailed at,
That's right.
when the grid commands to shut down, that take longer, like shorter or longer period of time. this flywheel is acting immediately. Then there's a microsecond acting buffer in the batteries, and then you have the rest of the stuff. Let's say the best of it, Bitcoin mining.
Now we've been talking a bunch about the grid, the data on the grid, the data on the grid. Joe, I know you have a bunch of experience that is not necessarily grid tied. Could you introduce us to your North Dakota site and help tell us a little bit about how the equation changes when you set up a site in the way that you've chosen to set up this North Dakota site?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I think it would be a good follow to kind of how we was talking about. Kind of the natural extension of that is the larger flexible load you have, the more impact it can have on the grid, subject to your lines being big enough pipes, right? You can only change it. So naturally, when we built the grid, it was a one-way highway from the fountain to the faucet, right? So when you think about getting the highest impact from flexible load, it naturally draws you into co-locating at the generation source. So that Atacon was kind of founded on this thesis of this is a key part of electrical infrastructure we're going to need to develop a bunch of. So the first project we had, which was kind of, I think Bitcoin was $23,000. We signed a 20-year PPA with a 1.2, this is going to be a shout out for Steve, gigawatt coal power plant in Bismarck, North Dakota. The story behind it is it's the largest employer in North Dakota. It is one of the 3 or 4 black start generators for northern MISO.
Clarify what that means for us, a black start generator.
So every section of the grid, like ERCOT or MISO or PJM, all these are grids in about 8 different chunks. 7 of them are connected. Texas is Texas. Each one of those has separate sections, so it's designed when the grid blacks out or goes down, you restart it in sections, right? And so we have kind of these anchor units around the country where if you want to restart northern Minnesota, this is what does it. And so when they build those power plants, they add extra redundancy, extra reliability to the design because they have to work when it's really cold or like there's a really bad weather event. So this plant's been working in that role for 40 years. They have a direct extension cord to downtown Minneapolis. So it's like having a 1.2 gigawatt plant sitting in your downtown block electrically. So fantastic performance. The utility that owned it in Minnesota just decided because of their ESG mandate, they didn't want to own it anymore. They were going to sell it. We came in, the bids for the plant were 24 bids, 23 of them were going to shut down and fire everybody. And all of them were wind developers that just wanted to put wind on the line. The other one was a group who has been in the power game and in the energy space in North Dakota for a long time. They purchased the plant. They were Bitcoin adjacent. They'd been exposed to the flexible load, and they loved the idea of how do you build up this energy campus view between all kinds of compute, leveraging flexible load, leveraging heat to when you have these kind of islanded big generation plants. So we took the risk with them. We signed the long-term offtake agreement. We developed out the infrastructure and power agreements and all the controls system to interact with the grid directly. We are populated by a handful of large institutional miners that all of you would know and none I can say. And the kind of the flexibility part of it is we have it automatically integrated with the MISO grid, which would be like the TVA grid. So whenever they send signaling, we are able to respond that entire facility effectively instantaneously. It takes us about 90 seconds to 3 minutes to pull down 210 megawatts of power.
And what does that do for operation of the actual generation itself?
Zero effect. So instead of having to ramp that power plant at 2.5 megawatts a minute, you ramped it at 200 megawatts in 90 seconds. And so effectively you have a coal or nuke plant that looks like a battery for all practical purposes. Javier is right. Batteries, some amount of batteries is needed for that very fast response, but the big punch of response is how fast you can ramp your generator up or take your load off.
So does this mean that, you're describing baseload, you're describing coal, and we spent the whole morning talking about the explosion and necessity of nuclear baseload.
Yeah.
Are people climbing up the walls to figure out how you can replicate this model on nukes?
I think we have a pretty good idea of how to do it. The biggest challenges are regulatory and the process the most of the nukes are in grids that are either still regulated, which is like a Duke or a TVA, or they're in a grid called PJM, which is basically the northern upper Midwest grid. All of them have extremely complicated regulations about placing load at the nukes, which has been put in place with them from like DOD as well as grid design stuff. So there's like a lot of legacy, for lack of a better word, crap to unpack there to co-locate flexible load. But I think you're going to see them actively deployed as this SMR wave kind of comes through, because the trick on those is you always need a first customer, and Bitcoin's also very good at that.
You know, I've heard that Rod has an uncle.
Uncle Rod.
No, Rod's uncle. Javi, it looked like you were going to say something. What were you thinking?
No, I wasn't. I was just listening and thinking about how like, yeah, it's basically like when you have load like Bitcoin mining, is just, I mean, I was thinking of the term virtual power plant, which is used also in the industry, and it's basically that. It's a virtual power plant, but one that is super efficient at ramping up and down, which is not common in nuclear power plants or hydro or coal. Like, these are much slow in acting or ramping resources.
I wanted to ask you, because you bring an interesting perspective, being in Spain and being with brains, being with folks that are not established and home based in the U.S. In the U.S., we use ERCOT as our petri dish. You get this entirely different international perspective. What are you hearing that's similar? What are you hearing that's different? How has the conversation evolved if you're not just in the United States?
I think the conversation is evolving very similarly everywhere. Like, there's a so the AI push is not only big in the US. There's a high demand. There's a high energy demand coming into the market. It's already there, and those grids that are advanced, like ERCOT or PJM in the US, or the Nordics in Europe, even though ENTSO-E covers the whole Europe, but you have differences in between TSOs in different regions. And FinGrid, for example, in Finland is one of the most advanced, but again, the whole Nordics is a complete different story when you look at it. These guys understand the need for flexible load, and they understand that generation needs to be base load mostly, and then renewables are great. Let's give an example. If you want to develop very quickly, like if you want to fulfill the demand for AI in a very quick way, one way to look at it is to just build, which was actually a topic before, building off-grid or microgrid, not connected to the grid, and then use solar and batteries, which is very fast to deploy, and it has a relatively low price per kilowatt hour. When you're looking at the storage, like the battery storage at the moment, like it's going down even below $100 per kilowatt hour storage, and then deploying that, and then later connecting to the grid using flexibility. These guys understand that. For example, in the Nordics, I think Spain, to give the example of Spain, because I know it firsthand, is waking up to this necessity. They're actually know it firsthand, that they're asking aggregators in Europe, like similar to the QSCs or CSPs in PM, aggregators of power that serve demand response. They're asking them to come back into the market. They left a few years ago because there was no demand for these services, and now they're like begging them to come back because they understand the problem. So I think that the issue of the high demand of the grid is understood in most places. Then you have the more advanced grids that I think are better positioned to serve the needs of these AI data centers that are coming into the market in troves.
I would love to kind of continue to extend this conversation. I want to start with Nima on this. We are talking about how the AI demand is characteristically very different from the Bitcoin demand. Characteristically very different. They're both 21st century loads, but they are like second cousins. They do very different things when you plug them in. They want very different things, very different trajectories, right? Nima, do you see that data coming out yet? Is there anything there for you to kind of dig into and start to understand on the kind of heavy technical side that you live and breathe?
So AI data centers are still developing, even when we talk with the hyperscalers, it's still something that's work in progress. However, some of the early data that we've seen on the power consumption and the load profiles of some of these data centers, it is unlike anything we've ever seen on the grid ever before.
What does that mean?
What that means is imagine a 100 to 100 megawatt site with oscillations of, so what I'm thinking is where you have 20, 30 megawatts oscillation. So you have drops, peaks and drops in them under a second. You're seeing
Within a second.
with less than a second.
Oh my
We're
goodness.
talking about milliseconds. Exactly. Cycle. And that's something that hasn't been seen before, not to this extent. You've never seen anything of, 20, 30 megawatt drop in less than a second.
And I heard grid operators love this.
And
That's not correct.
What? First off, explain at the layperson level when you're talking about a sub-cycle, you're talking about within a second, so within 60 hertz, a 20 megawatt shift, which is not an inconsequential amount of power. What does this do? What does a grid operator say or think when they see this happening on their grid?
So here's a point of comparison. The federally regulated maximum speed we can take power on and off in North Dakota is 100 megawatts a minute, and that is on a high voltage transmission line designed to move power, a lot of it.
And how much power is a high voltage translation line pulling at any point in time?
1,200 megawatts is what it's rated for. So you can change it by about 8% a minute. And so when you're talking about changing it by 20% every fifth of a second, it's like it's an order of magnitude both ways. Volatility. So you need to dampen the volatility.
Nima, how do you do that?
How do you do that, Nima?
So one of the methods that's being used at the moment is batteries acting as a buffer. That's sort of absorbing that shock and ensuring there is no impact on the data center and also to the grid. However, this is still, I believe this is still work in progress, still to be seen as we get more and more data on this one. I'm not sure how long this, if whether batteries are a good long-term solution for this. But currently at the state that we're at, I think batteries are the only solution to be acting as a buffer for data centers.
Why is that, Joe?
I've got a little bit of data on that, so I can expand a little bit. So Bitcoin is probably the next fastest thing. It's good at moving within a couple of seconds. This is like batteries are the only other comparable thing that can move and respond that fast and have that absorption of the battery to curb volatility. So what we're seeing is site design is starting to include, it's all over the place, but usually at least 20% of base plate just for voltage regulation.
Wow.
But we're also hearing a lot of innovation being done around like the power distribution units. So they like start dampening the voltage spikes from the machine level out is what they're working on. That's why these things are so expensive. So the amount of capital to do all this is a ton, which is what you're saying while they're training. And so we're still seeing load shapes that are like non-connectable, basically. Like you have to overbuild the infrastructure by 200% if you're going to have that much volatility. So you have to get it before you are pulling or pushing electrons back on the grid. You got to get the electron a little more grid friendly.
So is this leading us to a world of hyper complex hybridization? Because you have this AI load that is introducing a very serious problem. A grid operator has a mandate to do certain things with their grid, and they get kind of mad when you start throwing electrons on and off just haphazardly. Is hybridization the natural direction we go? Is there a missing technological step that's needed? What are we going to do?
100%.
Yeah, the term microgrid is like, in the terms of the grid, a microgrid is a 1,200 megawatt power plant with 3 kinds of data load on it.
3 kinds.
Well, you're going to have battery, flexible data, and firm data.
And is that all working before we ever put anything on a transmission line and send it to a consumer?
Yep. Flex load's the balancing load. So you're basically taking an order of magnitude off the grid impact, right? So you could have 1,000 megawatts here, but you really only need up to 300 megawatts of grid power because of the redundancy that comes in. So like you have volatility coming on the grid, you can turn more engines on, you can start ramping your flex load down, you can change your batteries. So you have a ton of, and that's all the controls on all of that is kind of where we're talking about. And this is kind of the mission that these guys have from their side is how are we going to have this control suite that is integrated at a relatively grid level where you're deploying, you're buffering the grid effectively.
Have we told you how glad we are that you're solving these problems so we don't have to?
I know I'm good at identifying them.
This
It
is
seemed to take a while to fix, but it's interesting.
But I mean, I think there's also like an evolution in the technology. Like you have now solid state batteries coming into the market that look more like supercapacitors. Like you understand for the layman, a supercapacitor has a lot of capacity, but it can only discharge it pretty fast. A battery doesn't have that capacity, but can discharge much slower. These solid state batteries are in between. So when these actually hit the market, or they're starting to hit the market, I know of a Finnish company called Donut that are promising a lot. It looks like they are, it's a big promise. When you combine these solid state batteries with flexible generation, with Bitcoin mining inside a microgrid, then you're basically able to flatten out those waves that Nima was describing. And I think that is technology that's going to be necessary, or that's going to be required by regulators to actually bring more AI data centers into the grid in the near future.
well said. Can we get it? This is blowing my mind, guys.
100%.
This is blowing my mind because if you want to know where the future is going, somebody said this to me a couple of years ago at NEMS. If you want to know where the future is going, what we're going to be doing in a year, just come to a NEMS and hear what these people are talking about. This is stuff that it doesn't exist yet. These are the people building it. So please avail yourself of every opportunity that you have to just pick their brains, connect with them. And can we get a huge round of applause for all of our panelists? This has been absolutely immense.